Hello, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day, and welcome to today's Love Data Week keynote presentation. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to remind you that more sessions are scheduled this week as part of Love Data Week. Love Data Week is an international celebration of data taking place every year during the week of Valentine's Day. We have put together many informative and useful sessions this week, so I encourage you to visit the Love Data Week webpage by clicking on this URL or scan this QR code to learn more and register. This slide summarizes the upcoming events for the remaining week. We already started yesterday. There were 2 sessions, but if you missed it, don't worry. We'll share the video recordings and the slides on the Love Data Week website. Many sessions have already sent out a Zoom link to registrants. So if you haven't registered, please click on the Contact Us link on the registration page and ask for the Zoom links. So these are for today, these are for tomorrow, and these are for Thursday. If you click on Register, and there'll be a Contact Us link at the bottom. So if you haven't registered, please click on there and ask for the Zoom link. Now let's get to today's NIH keynote address, which you have all been waiting for. As many of you are aware, NIH's new data management sharing policy went into effect on January 25th, 2023, replacing the 2003 data sharing policy. We just went through the first grant cycle under this new policy, and many questions have been raised. So we are very grateful to have NIH officers here to give us an in-depth overview of the new policy and answer our questions. Please note that this keynote address will be comprised of a 1-hour presentation shared by 3 speakers, followed by a 30 minutes Q&A session. During the talk, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll address them during the Q&A session. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for today's keynote address. Dr. Cindy Danielson is Associate Director of Systems Integration in the Office of Research Reporting and Analysis, which is a part of the Office of Extramural Research, OER, at the National Institute of Health, NIH. Cindy supports the management of reporting tools used for program management and analysis by NIH staff and members of the public, including NIH Report and Reporter, and coordinates policy implementation plans. She first joined NIH in 2013 as an AAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow in the National Institute of Nursing Research Office of Science Policy and Legislation, where she analyzed and reported on NINR's portfolio of research. She received her PhD in cell and molecular biology from Northwestern University, where she focused on the cell biology of HIV and host cell defenses, and her undergrad degree is in psychobiology from the University of Southern California. Dr. Lisa Federer is the acting director of the National Library of Medicine's Office of Strategic Initiatives, serving as a principal advisor to the NLM director for matters and programs concerning strategic directions of NLM, including open science, as well as analysis, evaluation, and reporting of and on NLM programs and activities. Prior to taking on this role, she served as NLM's data, science, and open science librarian. Before joining NLM, Lisa spent 5 years as a research data informationist at the National Institute of Health Library, where she developed and ran the library's data services program. She holds a PhD in information studies from the University of Maryland and an MLIS from the University of California, Los Angeles, as well as graduate certificates in data science and data visualization. Mr. Taunton Payne is the director of the Scientific Data Sharing Policy Division. Taunton leads a team responsible for a broad array of issues relating to data sharing, access, including the NIH Policy for Data Management Sharing, the NIH Genomic Data Sharing Policy, and management of the NIH Data Science Policy Council. Before becoming director of the division, Taunton led the clinical research policy team within the OSP division of clinical research and healthcare policy. While there, he advised NIH leadership on matters related to the Common Rule, certificates of confidentiality, HIPAA, and other privacy and human participant protection issues. Taunton began his OSP career in 2011 and first worked on issues relating to biosecurity and dual-use research of concern. He holds a dual master's degree from Columbia University and London School of Economics and Political Science, where he used the history of international relations. With that, I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it on to Mr. Taunton Payne, who will be our first presenter.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us here today and for that introduction. I think our plan is that we'll start by sort of going over the background of the policy and where it came from. We'll talk about the requirements that are in the policy, and the sort of expectations as well. And then we'll go over some of the actual sort of guidance that we've produced under this, as well as other kind of implementation activities. And I think we'll kind of end by talking a bit about how you can get started and what kinds of things you can be thinking about. Then I think we'll go to questions after that. So first off, why does NIH want scientific data to be shared? Different data sharing policies can have sort of different reasons that they articulate for this. But really, there are two main goals in the data management and sharing policy that went into effect last month. First, NIH really wants to enhance the rigor and the reproducibility of the research that we support with taxpayer funds. Sharing data helps to actually enable validation of research results. It makes high-value data sets accessible to people who may not have had access to them otherwise. It helps to accelerate future research directions, and it increases opportunities for citation and natural collaboration between research teams. But the other major reason is that it helps to promote public trust in research. Sharing data helps to foster transparency and accountability and demonstrates good stewardship over taxpayer funds. It also provides an opportunity to maximize research participants' contributions in recognition of the sacrifices that they make to participate in research. And it provides an opportunity to reaffirm appropriate protections for research participants' data. I don't want to give you the impression that this is the first data sharing policy that NIH has issued. We've had data sharing policies for a long time. Most notably, I think in 2003 with the NIH data sharing policy that really only applied to specific awards of $500,000 per year or more, but that did require that a data sharing plan be submitted with every application there. It also applied to the intramural research program. In 2007, we took another step forward with the Genome-Wide Association Studies policy, which was later expanded into the genomic data sharing policy, which really expects the sharing of large-scale human and non-human genomic data from all NIH-funded studies, typically in a publicly available data repository, and it has a number of other expectations as well. Another example, which I won't go into much detail about, is the NIH policy for dissemination of NIH-funded clinical trial information, which is sort of complementary to the Part 11 regulations that require that NIH-supported clinical trials register in clinicaltrials.gov and submit summary results information there. We've also had a long history of data sharing policies at the more local level in NIH. So first off, there are a couple of different types of these policies. In the first example, the autism data sharing policy has applied to research supported by several different institutes and centers. And sometimes institutes and centers can create their own policies that apply to the research that they fund. So for example, NIMH and NHLBI both have specific policies for their applicants. Sometimes large programs will also create, sort of specific and additional data sharing expectations, usually in advance of what's going on at the agency level. So for example, the NCI Cancer Moonshot or the HEAL program both have sort of, more specific data sharing policies in place. But despite this history of data sharing, we're aware of a sort of literature that shows, kind of poor availability of data underlying peer-reviewed, publications. I won't go into great detail about this, but these are just 3 examples from the last 18 months or so, showing in most cases not better than 40% availability for publications, and in some cases even as low as 6.8% of papers, being able to provide data, when requested. And I think we can do better than that. And I think in general, the public expects that we do better than that. So just as an example of this, here is a Pew survey from 2019 asking US adults to rank the factors that they would say, would cause them to trust research more. And the number one factor that they provided are that data are openly available to the public. So in recognition of some of these issues, as well as in response to growing mandates from the last several White House administrations and from Congress, we started a policy development process back in 2016, where we issued the sort of first, public engagement, which was, a request for information on various different issues related to this policy. And we've kept up a sort of consistent, consultative approach since that time, issuing multiple sort of requests for information or comment in relation to this policy. Actually culminating in a draft in 2019 that got about 200 public comments on it. At the same time, we also started a formal tribal consultation process with tribes around the country and sought input from the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections, and coordinated with other departments and agencies through the Subcommittee on Open Science under the National Science and Technology Council. All of this feedback was really used to develop a final policy that was issued in October 2020 and took effect last month. So now I'll talk about what the policy sort of specifically requires. So it requires the submission of a data management and sharing plan for all NIH-funded research that would generally describe how, where, and when data will be shared, and I'll be coming back to say more about this later. And it requires compliance with the version of the plan that is approved by the funding NIH Institute, Center, or office. And we do say that compliance with plans can affect future funding decisions. It became effective on January 25th, 2023 for new and competing applications submitted to NIH for that receipt date and later receipt dates. And it will replace the 2003 data sharing policy for those awards going forward. Just to give you an idea of what it applies to, so it applies to all research that generates scientific data, and this includes most research projects, some career development awards, so Ks. It does include, SBIR and STTR awards, although there are, certain considerations for those that I'll say, more about later, and things like research centers. But it does not apply to research projects that do not generate scientific data or are not doing research. So this includes all the Ts and Fs, as well as things, like construction and sort of conference grants. Those are not included in this policy. We have provided a sort of comprehensive list of codes of activities that are subject to the policy. And that's on the sharing.nih.gov website, which we'll say more about later. So to get sort of even more specific about what the policy applies to, it applies to all NIH-supported research that generates scientific data. The policy also expects that these same scientific data are what be addressed in data management and sharing plans. And it's specifically defined in the policy as the recorded factual material that's of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, regardless of whether the data are used to support scholarly publications or not. And it really relates to the proposed research questions and can include things like unpublished null results. It can also include things like qualitative data, if they meet the definition of scientific data, or data produced using fundamental basic science techniques. So again, if it meets the definition of scientific data. But I want to be clear here that the policy is not requiring the sharing of all data that are generated in the course of your research project, only those that meet the definition of scientific data. And there are a number of things that are specifically carved out of this definition. So laboratory notebooks, things like preliminary analyses, completed case report forms from clinical trials, or any kind of physical objects like laboratory biospecimens. In terms of the timelines for when data should be shared, so data that underlie peer-reviewed publications should be shared no later than the time of that publication. And we have provided some frequently asked questions about this specifically. And for data that underlie other kind of findings, those should be shared by the end of the award. And in terms of how long data should be shared once they have been made available, so the policy does not provide a specific timeline. It does not say it needs to be, for example, for 5 or 10 years or something like that. Rather, what we're doing is asking people to sort of consider what other relevant requirements they may be subject to. So for example, from journals or things like repositories, and using those to inform sort of what their timeline should be. So in many cases, things like repositories will indicate that, they'll make data available for a certain amount of time. And oftentimes right now, that can be, sort of for as long as the, actual repository is sort of operating. So there's a couple of specific expectations for plans that I think are worth going through. So first, I mentioned earlier that there's really only 2 requirements in the policy. So it requires the submission of a plan and adherence to that plan. It does not require data sharing, but it does expect that in drafting plans, applicants will maximize appropriate data sharing, recognizing that there are certain justifiable limitations to sharing data, and that while all data should be managed, not all data must or can be shared. Sharing should, of course, be responsibly implemented, and plans should outline the protection of privacy, rights, and confidentiality of research participants. And of course, we expect people to continue abiding by existing laws, regulations, and policies that may apply to them, such as the HIPAA privacy rule or the common rule or state laws. I also want to point out that this means that you should continue to follow NIH policies that might relate to data sharing and may set additional, more specific expectations. I think in general, the approach that we want people to take through developing data management and sharing plans is to prospectively plan for how they're going to manage and to share their data. So recognizing that in order for sharing to be appropriate, there must be certain sort of justifiable ethical, legal, and technical factors that may limit sharing of data. We've provided a series of frequently asked questions on the sharing.nih.gov site about this. And one of them relates to sort of examples of potentially justifiable factors for limiting sharing. So for example, when informed consent would not permit or would limit the scope or sharing of use of data. If there are privacy or if the privacy or the safety of research participants would be compromised, and actual available protections like certificates of confidentiality would be insufficient to protect them. If there are explicit federal, state, local, or tribal laws, regulations, or policies that would prohibit disclosure, those must, of course, be followed. And if there are sort of types of restrictions or limitations imposed by existing or anticipated agreements with other parties. So for example, a data use agreement that you would need to enter into in order to get access to data under HIPAA, or a term and condition for the use of getting access to data in a data repository that may impose limitations on your ability to share subsequent data. And then in some cases it may simply not be practical to digitize certain types of data. There's also a couple of categories of limitations that we've generally said would not be justifiable. So these are when data are considered to be too small, if researchers anticipate that their data will not be widely used, or if data are not thought to have a suitable data repository. And there's a couple of other considerations that I want to highlight for you as well. So first, and I'll say more about this later, NIH respects tribal sovereignty, and I think we recognize that there may be certain kinds of limitations that are certainly appropriate in that context. And as I mentioned earlier, there are certain considerations for SBIR and STTR awards. So the program policy directive permits withholding data for 20 years in those cases, as stipulated in actual agreements, and consistent with program goals. So I'll switch now to talking a bit more about sort of, the specific expectations for data management and sharing plans. So we've provided a number of recommended elements to include in data management and sharing plans to ensure that, you're providing sufficient information to NIH about like what your plans are. So these include sort of describing the data and the metadata that will be preserved and shared, and the rationale for doing so, as well as any, kind of associated documentation that would be shared with them. Whether there are related tools, software, or code that would be needed to access and to manipulate those data. This is not an expectation for people to share tools, software, or code that they develop. That may be addressed in other policies. It is not addressed in the data management and sharing policy. Rather, this is a element for sort of describing if those would be necessary in order to access the data. Whether there will be any standards that are applied to the scientific data and to the metadata, I think in some cases it may be necessary to acknowledge that there are no sort of consensus standards. What the specific repository to be used is, what persistent identifier will be used, and sort of when and how long data will be made available for. What sort of factors might affect access, distribution, and reuse. So going back to that previous slide about potentially justifiable limitations, and whether access to data will be actually controlled or not. And last, sort of oversight of data management. We've gotten a couple of questions about this, so I want to indicate that the policy is not requiring that any specific individual, be listed in this element. And certain institutions may handle it certain ways. So it's appropriate to check with your institution first to find out how this should be filled out. So to kind of help people get started in filling out a data management and sharing plan, we've provided a sort of optional format page that I think breaks these elements down and includes a kind of series of sort of sub-elements to help people understand them. It's not a requirement to use it, and there are alternatives out there, but it's something to sort of help people get started thinking about what a plan might look like. We've generally recommended that plans be no more than about 2 pages in length, but that's not a hard requirement. And we certainly recognize that there's going to be cases where, for example, people have a large number of, different data types to describe, and so it may be necessary to exceed 2 pages. I do also, want to mention that this is sort of the first version of this that we've released, and that we actually have a pilot project ongoing right now with the Federal Demonstration Partnership to sort of test structured templates, for a data management and sharing plan. So there may be more developments in the future. So one aspect of the policy that I really want to highlight is that it encourages the use of established repositories as the preferred method for sharing scientific data. And I think one thing that we heard during the public comment process was that there was a lot of interest in understanding how to sort of identify appropriate data repositories. So we worked with a number of other departments and agencies to come up with sort of supplemental information to help people think through, what kind of repositories might be appropriate. And this includes a sort of list of desirable characteristics, both for sort of basic repositories, but also, for ones dealing with human data. One point that I do want to make is that the policy does not require the use of any particular repository. And it does not say, for example, also that it has to be funded by NIH. But I do want to indicate that certain other policies at NIH and actual specific funding opportunity announcements may sort of designate specific repositories or sets of repositories that they want data to be submitted to. So, pay attention to those. To help people sort of think through, what types of repositories might be appropriate to submit data to, the supplemental information has really indicated that we want to prioritize data type and discipline specific data repositories. This is, a recommendation and not a hard, requirement. But to help people think through sort of those different categories, we've provided a list of, NIH-supported data repositories. It's not comprehensive, and it is just, limited to those ones that are, NIH-supported. But, that's there to sort of help you, see what, options might exist. Beyond sort of data type and discipline specific repositories, there are other potentially suitable options as well. So we're certainly aware that a number of institutions are standing up their own repositories around the country. In some cases, it may be appropriate to share small data sets associated with publications through PubMed Central, which can, I think, accept data sets up to perhaps 2 gigabytes or so. And then, in addition, we're certainly aware that there's a growing, ecosystem of what we call generalist data repositories that, are sort of set up to take data from a variety of different research types and, different data types. And we've had a sort of number of ongoing, engagements with them, and there are, educational resources out there to sort of help you get, oriented to them on the Office of Data Science Strategy website. So I'm going to switch now to talking a bit about the resources that we've provided to help people, think through sort of, issues related to when you're working with, human research participant data. So first off, I think a common question that we got is what the expectation for informed consent under this policy is. So I want to be clear that the policy encourages researchers and institutions to establish robust consent processes, but the policy does not sort of set a specific expectation, to obtain consent or for how that will be handled, recognizing that, there's a variety of different situations and that one thing I've heard is that people, have said that this policy is requiring broad consent to be obtained. That's not true. This policy does not require that consent be obtained in any particular way, partly out of recognition that, broad consent may not be appropriate in every context. Rather, the policy, has acknowledged that there may be, certain limitations on sharing based on the informed consent, either, existing or to be obtained. And to help people understand how they might incorporate, language about data sharing into consent to be obtained in the future, we issued a sort of resource that contains points to consider and sample language that can be incorporated into informed consent forms for future use and sharing of both data and specimens. So that's available now, and it's a recommendation, not a requirement, but it's there to be helpful. We've also heard a number of questions about protecting privacy, and so we issued supplemental information last year about actually protecting privacy when sharing human research participant data. So what we've done is to provide a non-binding framework that helps institutions and researchers think through how they might protect privacy in their particular context. It's not intended as a guide for regulatory compliance, so for HIPAA or for the Common Rule, but it is intended to be sort of broadly applicable in different research contexts, and it establishes shared principles, one set of approaches for best practices, certainly recognizing that there may be other ways to also sort of satisfy the principles of this document, and offers sort of specific set of considerations for when data should be made available either in a controlled fashion or in an unrestricted fashion. So just to sort of zero in on the best practices component, so there were 3 different things that we've indicated can be sort of implemented in the same sort of context. So first, the best practices really suggest de-identifying scientific data to the greatest extent possible while maintaining scientific utility. And to do so by using both the Common Rule and HIPAA privacy rule standards for de-identification. But even then, we do ask people to consider the risks of sharing the information, even when it is de-identified, and to consider sharing identifiable information only when there is explicit consent to do so. Second, in addition to this, we would also like people to use agreements to cover the transfer of data between different parties, and that these data transfer agreements, would actually communicate things like the limitations on use, include prohibitions on re-identification of data and of recontact of research participants. And last, we really want people to sort of understand the applicable legal protections that they're operating under and the limitations on disclosures that they may put in place, and to understand certain types of protections like certificates of confidentiality. Going back to my earlier slide where I mentioned that we undertook a tribal consultation starting in 2019, one product of that was to develop the supplemental information to sort of help guide researchers develop an appropriate data management and sharing plan when working with tribes. And so it really emphasizes respect for tribal sovereignty, the use of partnerships and mutual agreements, and building trust between the different parties. So just to sort of highlight some of the best practices themselves. So we really want people to understand tribal sovereignty and the laws, regulations, policies, and preferences of the tribes that they're working with. To engage as early as possible with tribes when developing a data management and sharing plan before the research begins, and to continue that engagement throughout the process. To really focus on establishing mutually beneficial partnerships, and to do things like agree in advance who is going to manage the data, whether it be a tribe, a researcher, or a trusted third party. And in some cases, to consider whether additional protections may be necessary. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Cindy.
Thanks, Taunton. So I'm with NIH's Office of Extramural Research, and our role in implementing this policy includes implementing changes to the grant application forms and the systems to capture this information on the data management and sharing plan, as well as costs. So I want to talk a bit about that. And first, in terms of allowable costs, when the policy was issued, NIH also put out a supplemental information outlining what types of costs might be considered allowable costs of data management and sharing. And this indicated that reasonable costs are allowed in your budget requests, and these costs must be incurred during the performance period. And the types of allowable costs can support activities including curating data, developing supporting documentation, preserving and sharing data through repositories, as well as local data management considerations, so getting your data ready to share. There are some types of costs which are not considered direct data sharing costs for the purpose of a budget request, and this would include any sort of infrastructure costs used across your institution, which would already be included in your indirect costs, as well as costs associated with the routine conduct of research. So the costs of getting access to research data shared by others, for example. And in terms of what the actual dollars are going to look like, over time, NIH really does hope to learn more about what constitutes reasonable costs for these various types of data management and sharing activities, which would certainly vary by field and data type. Next slide, please. Here's a brief overview of how data management and sharing plans will be submitted and reviewed. And I'll point out that these details are specific to extramural grant awards, but there are analogous processes in place for other types of funding to which the policy does apply, including contracts, other transaction awards, as well as NIH intramural research program. So for grant awards, the data management and sharing plan is submitted as part of your application. And there's a brief plan description as well as budget information located in the budget justification section, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then the full plan, which is roughly that 2-page document covering the elements that Taunton talked through, that is a separate attachment. And again, I'll talk about the details of where you'll include that. And so then after this information has come in with your competing application, the plan will be assessed before any award is made. And during initial peer review, the peer reviewers are not going to be looking at your plans. They're not the ones who will determine whether those are acceptable, but they may comment on the budget and whether the budget appears to be reasonable, just as they do other budgetary aspects during their review. But it's actually NIH program staff who will assess the plans and determine whether the plans are acceptable and can be approved as is, or if there are any updates that might be needed. NIH has indicated that plans can be revised, and this can occur before an award is made, as well as after an award has been made. And if there are changes to a project, we do want to make sure that your plans are up to date and reflect what's happening with your plan and your proposed strategy to manage and share data. We did notice a question about one particular situation, say a phased award, a K99 ROO, and what information do you need to cover in your plan? Will that include both phases? And first, I'll note that please do refer to your specific funding opportunity announcement for any more specific details. But in general, with a situation like that, if the rest of the application does ask for your research plans over both phases, the data management and sharing plan should include this, the same type of plans. But one point on that is if plans do change, then you would consider whether you need to update those. So when you get close to your your later phase, or just in a regular award in your later years, if there is some change, then please do work with your NIH program officer to make sure that your plan is updated and reflects what you're going to do. So with that said, after the plan is approved and your award is made, that data management and sharing plan will be incorporated as a term and condition of your award, and it will be compliance with that plan will be monitored at regular reporting intervals. I'll talk a bit about that momentarily, but this is really part of the regular progress reporting. And then compliance with your approved plan may factor into future funding decisions. Next slide, please. So in preparation for an award, the program staff, as I just mentioned, will be the ones to determine if your plan can be approved as it is, and they'll be looking to see whether the information has been adequately addressed and the reasonableness of those responses in light of your specific research project. And applications will only be funded once the DMS plan is found complete and acceptable. If there are any issues with the plan that you submitted and is part of your competing applications, you will have an opportunity to work together with NIH staff to resolve those, and that would occur through the standard just-in-time process. If there are any concerns with what you've laid out or any clarifications needed, then you will hear from NIH staff at that time. And again, as I've mentioned on the previous slide, if there is a need to update your plans, even after award throughout the award lifecycle, if revisions are necessary, say you're going in a new scientific direction, perhaps a new and better data repository is available than what was available at the time you prepared your initial plan, or if the timeline needs to change, then you would reach out to NIH staff and make sure that they are aware of those changes, and they would again need to assess those new plans. Next slide, please. So compliance, and we did see a couple questions about what that looks like. So first, the DMS plan will become a term and condition of your award, and in general, the compliance monitoring would occur through the regular progress report cycles. So starting with the annual progress reports, and then the recipient would be reporting progress on implementing your approved DMS plan each year as part of the Research Performance Progress Report, or RPPR. And NIH is working on updating those instructions to make sure you know what information will be needed. And then NIH will be reviewing this compliance on an annual basis. And if there are any issues, then will be kind of case situation dependent on what might be needed. But it's NIH's goal to work with the recipients to make sure that you're able to follow through with your plans. Next slide, please. Okay, so next I want to talk about some changes to the application forms. And for those of you who've already submitted a plan with one of our recent due dates, then you have already seen this. But for those who might be looking forward to a competing application in the coming months or coming cycles, then these details should be useful. And just to be clear, the policy does apply to competing applications only. So if you already have an award that was made prior to this policy going into effect, you will not immediately have to comply with this. You would not need to submit a DMS plan until you come back in for a competing renewal or a new project. So when you are preparing your competing applications, we have updated versions of the grant application forms that you'll use. It's called Forms H. And this includes updated instructions, which provide a lot of details on what information should be included and any information on format or other aspects. So in brief, there's a new field added to the PHS 398 forms to collect the data management and sharing plan as a PDF attachment. It will be one attachment per application. And this will be attached to a new field called Other Plans. And this is different from where previously, if you were subject to a previous data sharing policy or genomic data sharing policy, you would have submitted those plans to the resource sharing plan section. Moving forward, this data management and sharing plan, which if you are subject to the genomic data sharing policy, you'll incorporate those aspects into your single DMS plan and attach it to the other plans section. In general, this other plans section with your DMS plan will not be visible to peer reviewers, except for a very limited number of cases for certain funding opportunities. Next slide, please. And we did see some questions about what happens to the resource sharing plan field. Do I still need to use this? And the answer is not generally, unless you have a reason to. And that reason could be because you are developing, say, research tools or model organisms. And if you're subject to these other NIH-wide sharing policies, then you will need to cover those. Or if the funding opportunity announcement you are responding to asks for a specific type of resource sharing plan, might be a software dissemination plan, or something specific that is outside of the scope of the data management and sharing plan, then that field does continue to exist for when that is needed. We have put in place some validations to make sure that when a data management and sharing plan is required, it's very clear, so you won't be able to submit your application unless that's attached there. And likewise, if a data management sharing plan is not needed, then nothing should be submitted there, and you'll get those validations to make sure that you're including what you need. There was a question about some issues with a particular budget validation, and I'll talk about that in a moment when I get to that slide. So next slide, please. So in terms of the budget, once you have developed your plan, your data management and sharing plan, and thought through your strategy of what data you'll be generating, what you plan to share, where you will share it, and all of those other details, then that kind of feeds into the budget. NIH, of course, does acknowledge that some of these activities do carry costs. And once you've determined what that figure is for the direct cost that you will be requesting, if needed to support those activities, then you'll be entering that information in your budget request. And if you are submitting a detailed budget, then you will add a line item and you'll name this data management and sharing costs. And you will enter the dollar figure there. If you are not requesting any funds, then you can enter 0. That is acceptable from a NIH's validation perspective. If you're getting any sort of issues with, say, a specific system-to-system provider, then please do reach out to either the ERA service desk, especially if that's impacting your submission. We want to make sure that someone can work with you on that, and perhaps with your specific system-to-system provider, because this should allow 0 as a valid figure here. If you are submitting a modular budget, then of course there's no line items there. Instead, you'll incorporate that information into your budget justification attachment. Specifically, the additional narrative justification is where this is going to be included. Next slide, please. All right, so in addition to providing the actual dollar amount, you'll need to justify your request for that data management and sharing budget. And you'll be including in the existing budget justification attachment, so not a standalone PDF attachment, but where you're justifying other costs, you'll include a section where you're justifying your data management and sharing costs. And this will include really 2 parts. One is a brief summary of your DMS plan, and another is a description of the cost. And this is expected to be about half a page. There's no validations. This is within an existing attachment, but that's kind of the general amount that we're looking for. Nothing, it's too lengthy, not more than your plan, for example. And again, you'll include this information in your existing budget justification attachment. That location will vary depending if you're doing a detailed budget or a modular. Next slide, please. So we did see a number of questions on costs, and we did want to point out that just maybe a week or so, we did add some new FAQs to the sharing site on budget and costs. And I want to talk through a few of these because there were some themes in the questions that this should be able to address. So we do have questions and answers on how to reflect your data management and sharing costs in different parts of your application for the R&R budget, for the modular budget, how you handle costs incurred by subawards, and what to do if you don't anticipate any direct costs. And on that point, in general, we do point to the application instructions, which have a lot of details. But for that a cost question, if you don't have any costs, just enter 0, and that's allowed. You'll also need to justify that in the budget justification. Say, for example, if you're handling things with institutional resources, then that would make, perhaps make sense to cover there. And if you are experiencing any issues, please do reach out to make sure those are resolved. Next slide, please. Okay, so another question on costs. What should I include in that budget justification summary regarding data management and sharing costs? And some details here that are helpful to put that together. First, you'll label this section as the data management and sharing justification, which is part of that overall budget justification attachment. You'll indicate the amount and a brief justification of the activities that will incur costs. In addition to the cost information, we are asking for a brief summary of your plan. And you'll note here, a summary of what type of data you'll be preserving and sharing. And if you're sharing that in a repository, then you would indicate the name of the repository or location there. And then some more details related to cost, just summarizing according to the general cost categories that were listed in that allowable cost notice. To make sure that the peer reviewers who are looking at your budget and NIH staff will have sufficient information to determine what activities, whether the costs are reasonable and allowable for the activities you are proposing. Next slide, please. So another question that we saw was asked about here, personnel specifically. How do you budget effort for personnel whose duties are included and budgeted as part of the data management sharing plan? And the answer to this one is that must be included in that single line item. Yeah, I think that's a pretty straightforward one here. Next slide, please. And a number of others. I won't talk through them all, but questions about subscription fees to an electronic lab notebook system, how to handle long-term preservation and sharing beyond the award period, whether the costs are included in any sort of caps, and yes, they are. Yeah, so I will say if you have specific questions that relate to budgeting or costs for the data management and sharing plan, we do have a dedicated office within the Office of Extramural Research, and our grants policy office is going to be in the best position to respond to these cost questions. And so you can reach out to them directly at grantspolicy@nih.gov. And so in general, we have the sharing mailbox, which we're happy to be a first stop and respond to most general policy questions. But if it is cost specific, then you want to reach out to the grants policy mailbox instead. Next slide, please. Okay, so while I did go through a number of those new budget FAQs, I do just want to note that there are a number of other questions on different topics. So do take a look at the FAQ page. This should be a very helpful resource, especially if you've already looked through, the other existing information on the website. And next slide. Okay, so in terms of what else is on the website and what sections you might want to take a look at, just a quick overview of what is located on sharing.nih.gov. And this is intended as a central access point to get information not only on the data management and sharing policy, but on other NIH data sharing policies. And so there's information also on the genomic data sharing policy, as well as model organism and research tools sharing policies as well. And as new information becomes available, it will be updated on the site, so you can make sure you're looking at the most recent information. Next slide, please. So specific to the data management and sharing policy, we do have pages with resources on planning and budgeting. So this will cover a lot of the information that you heard today in terms of expectations for writing a plan, for budgeting in your application, and links out to instructions and information about format. Next slide, please. There's also resources for understanding other sharing policies, and in particular, depending on the type of results that you expect might be coming from your research, you might be subject to other policies as well. Next slide, please. And so we do have a tool that might be useful that you can walk through by thinking about the types of outputs your research will generate and getting an idea of what other policies you might be subject to so that you can prepare for that ahead of your application. Next slide, please. All right, and I'm going to turn it back over to Taunton to talk about a couple other resources that are more recently available here.
Great, thank you. On that sharing.nih.gov website, one of the things we've provided fairly recently is a number of sample data management and sharing plans that we've really made available for sort of educational purposes. And by sample plans, what I mean is one that is filled out as if it were for a sort of given research context. So we have, for example, some about clinical data for sort of more like clinical research contexts, things like human and non-human genomic data, examples for sort of when you're doing secondary research. So if you are, obtaining and accessing data, one's working with sort of model organisms or focused on things like, actual technology development. So there's a number of them, available there, and they're tended, and sort of be instructive about, how one might go about, drafting a data management and sharing plan in different contexts. These are things that we'll probably, be updating over time and possibly expanding. In terms of sort of how you can get started, if you haven't already, I think one of the things, to sort of think about first is sort of what existing resources might exist at your institution that might be set up to sort of help you, such as data librarians or, repositories that I mentioned earlier that institutions might be setting up. There are, of course, the sample plans that I just described, but you can also try, drafting a data management and sharing plan, based on those recommended elements that we described earlier. The format page, is also something that you can use to sort of, get started. You can also think about sort of what your past data sharing practices may have been to sort of meet, other funder or sort of journal expectations for sharing, and what you might have to be able to do differently in the future to comply with this policy. And last, I think a really important part of this is to sort of read carefully the funding opportunity announcement, that you might be interested, in applying to, because there may be sort of more specific expectations listed there as well. So I will turn it over to Lisa to say more about this.
Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about the role of librarians in working on this policy. So Taunton mentioned data librarians. Many libraries do have librarians who specialize in data and have expertise in data management and sharing, metadata, controlled vocabularies, standards, these sorts of things. So data librarians can be a really helpful resource, not only when you're thinking about putting together your plan, but as you're actually carrying out the plan. There are also non-data librarians, so liaison librarians or subject area librarians who have some familiarity with a particular discipline because that's where they specialize. And so they may have some knowledge of what are the repositories that are commonly used in this discipline or field, or what are the standards that are often used. So they probably don't have deep expertise in data in the way that a data librarian would, but may be able to offer some additional help. And there's also, in many institutions, librarians who focus on scholarly communications issues and may have the ability to provide guidance on selecting a license, for example, for sharing data. There's lots of different licenses that you may select for doing so, and they may be able to provide guidance on what is most appropriate for you. Next slide, please. I also want to talk a little bit about some resources that are intended for librarians, but also could be potentially useful to the non-librarians out there. The National Library of Medicine has a network of the National Library of Medicine with regional medical libraries spread around the country to reach out to libraries and individuals in their region. There's also a National Center for Data Services that the NLM runs. And this center is designed to provide training for librarians in a variety of areas related to data management and sharing, and specifically have been providing quite a lot of training on this policy and roles for librarians and helping researchers to meet the requirements of the policy. Next slide. The NCDS does maintain on their website, which I've given a link to here, a number of resources along with training opportunities. There is a toolkit that they have put together in collaboration with a group of volunteer librarians from around the country. There's a data glossary and some other resources to help librarians get up to speed on providing these sorts of services at their institutions. Next slide. I also want to highlight the work of the Data Curation Network, or the DCN, which is a community-led network of curators. So many of them are librarians or curators who are affiliated with their institution's institutional repository and are able to provide expert guidance on curating data for specific disciplines. So if, say, I'm at an institution and somebody comes to me with a type of data that I'm not an expert in, if I was part of this, I could reach out to others in the network and say, like, here's this, I don't know how to handle this. Can someone assist with that? So they have quite a lot of expertise that they are able to bring to the table. Next slide. In addition to doing the data curation, DCN also does quite a lot of training to help upskill librarians and curators in this area. They use this curated model to describe the workflow of doing this curation. So it involves checking the files, understanding the documentation, requesting any information that's missing, augmenting the submission if needed, transforming the format, again, if needed, evaluate for fairness. So is the data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and then document everything throughout. So people that bring this kind of expertise are not necessarily the scientists with the subject matter expertise, but I think it can be really helpful for someone like a librarian or a curator to bring that outside view and to make sure that the documentation is clear, because I think a lot of times it can be easy to assume that people will understand what we've said when that may not be the case. So having that extra set of eyes, I think, can be really helpful. So yeah, just in general, I think librarians can play a really important role here, and encourage you to work with the librarians at your institution. And next slide, and I think I'm handing it back to Taunton at this point.
Great, thank you. So I'll kind of wrap up here in the next couple of slides. So, I think one thing to sort of think about, as we're heading into, 2023 and 2024 is, at the beginning of 2022, we sort of laid out, a little bit of a roadmap in terms of what to expect going to 2023 and beyond. So a number of those things are now, publicly available. We didn't touch on this earlier, but there is a two-part webinar series that we hosted on this policy, where we, put questions from the, actual participants last summer, and that's actually on the sharing.nih.gov website, as well as other resources, including things like FAQs that we discussed. We I think have gone over, both of those sort of supplemental information documents, relating both to tribes and to research participant privacy. There is one other part that I haven't gone into detail about in this talk, which is, we also indicated that, we'd be keeping the, NIH genomic data sharing policy sort of, in place, and that policy is one that also, requires the submission of a plan. The plan actually looked fairly similar to the data management and sharing plan, but we didn't want there to be sort of redundancy, people having to submit multiple plans. So we indicated last year that, starting with the January 25th, 2023 date going forward, applications that are actually subject to the GDS policy will no longer have to submit a GDS plan. Rather, they will simply use the data management and sharing plan as part of the DMS policy. And in 2023 and beyond, I think the things that you can sort of actually expect from us are additional FAQs. We write these sort of based on what we hear from people and the kind of questions that we receive, both in talks like this, but also to the inbox, and sort of future guidance on issues as they come up. We're also going to be doing sort of a long and short-term assessment of the policy to see if it's meeting its goals. And we'll be thinking a lot more about sort of incentives for data sharing and sort of what NIH can do to kind of help people want to do the things that this policy is asking them to do. One sort of last point that I'll touch on here is, a number of you may have sort of heard that last year, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy issued a memo to departments and agencies asking them to sort of develop their own plans for how they would sort of achieve three things. And these sort of came on different timelines. So first off, making publications that result from federally funded research freely available and accessible without embargo. That the scientific data that underlie those publications will be made accessible at the time of publication, and to have approaches in place for sharing scientific data that do not underlie publication, and also to sort of work towards the collection and sharing of appropriate metadata for publications and data, and actually using digital persistent identifiers for publications, data, researchers, and sort of other objects. I want to sort of indicate that we're working on the plan right now. We do plan to sort of make it publicly available as soon as it is. One point that I want to raise for you is that while it does ask agencies to sort of develop a plan for how they're going to make scientific data underlying publications accessible, this is something that we think that the data management and sharing policy does. So you should not anticipate any changes to this policy. So I'll stop there, and I think we can have some time for questions.
Thank you. We got a lot of questions in the Q&A box, so I'm going to share the slides. Can you see okay?
It's a bit small. Could you put the presentation full screen on? Oh, there we go. Perfect.
All right. So these are the questions submitted during Taunton's talk. So doesn't necessarily mean that he needs to answer all that, but I'm going to read it off to you. The first question, I think it was regarding slide 11. What is required is the data sharing plan, but data sharing is not required?
That's correct. So the policy does not technically require sharing data. Rather, what it requires is the submission of a plan and adherence to the version of the plan that is approved by the NIH Institute, Center, or office that funds the research. We do expect, though, that people will maximize appropriate data sharing, but we understand that in order for sharing to be appropriate, there are certain justifiable limitations on sharing that may have to be in place. So, for example, if the informed consent of research participants is totally contrary to sharing data, that's a reason why you might have to, limit sharing in some cases. So that's why we're not saying that it's required, but rather that we expect you to maximize appropriate sharing.
Thank you. The second question is, it's very challenging to know where we should propose saying that we'll submit data for non-genomic data. In my field of immunology, there are some emerging repositories for flow cytometry data, but very unclear if they will last and be available forever, and there will be a fee or have a cost. I propose sharing in one of these in a recent application, but in reality, I have no idea if it exists. If it still exists in 2 years when the data is there, and what the standard then will be.
Yeah, so I have sort of three thoughts on this, and I welcome my colleagues to weigh in as well. So first, in the desirable characteristics, for repositories, one of the characteristics that we've indicated is that they are sort of clear what their long-term plan is for the repository and what their sort of data retention policy is. So that's something that should help over time as those become more, I think, universally adopted. Help to make that kind of thing clearer when you're choosing a data repository. Second, in terms of repositories that may be relevant for immunology, I would refer back, of course, to that list that we've provided as sort of a starting point. I do know that one of the NIH-funded repositories on that is Import, where a number of immunology studies have chosen to share their data. And the last point I'll make about immunology specifically is that I believe the American Association of Immunologists has provided some resources for researchers in the immunology field to consider when developing data management and sharing plans, to sort of help them work through what are their scientific data for a particular research type. So you may want to look that up as well. Cindy, Lisa, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, you've covered that from my perspective. Thanks.
I would just add, not necessarily for immunology in particular, but in scenarios like this where there doesn't really seem to be a natural home for a specific type of data, generalist repositories are always an option. So they will accept data regardless of the data type or discipline. So in those cases where there's not a subject-specific repository that really fits the bill, that can be an option as well.
Thank you. And well, I just want to also plug in, we have an institutional repository, which is free to all WashU researchers. So feel free to use that one as well. Third question, without established standards, how does NIH expect to be able to merge data across the studies?
Well, I think standards are something that are sort of context and field specific. And in some cases, there may be expectations for specific FOAs or for things like specific repositories for the use of certain types of standards. So you should pay attention for those. But in other cases, I think this is something that we'll be working towards over time. Lisa, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to that.
No, I think that's that covers it. Yeah.
I would like to add some. I know there's a common data element for clinical data, so very well established standards, but there aren't well established standards for basic research science. So if NLM or NIH can work on those things to help the basic researchers, that would be a huge help. Just want to plug that in.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly address common data elements since you mentioned it. So these common data elements are standardized ways of asking a question and standardized ways of asking or answering that question. So this ensures that if these CDEs are used across sites or different trials or whatever, they will be interoperable. And NLM does maintain a CDE repository if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Number 4, what is the procedure to receive access to the shared data? Will a proposal need to be submitted for a researcher to receive access, or will the data be open access, or does this depend on the repository?
Yeah, so I think it does depend, on the repository. I think the only case in which NIH has really set up agency-wide expectations for how this will work are for human genomic data that are submitted under the NIH, GDS policy. In that case, we do have very specific policy expectations for how access will be provided. But for everything else, it really is going to be sort of, repository specific.
Thank you. The last question, has the NIH discussed increasing budgets to support the time, salary, and fees data processing required for this? Similarly, will the NIH fund repository that it comply? I understand you don't require specific repository, but I don't see how this will be sustainable unless the NIH designates and funds appropriate repository that it allow long-term storage.
Sure. So I'll just say first that, I don't believe right now that NIH has planned to, increase the, budget caps or anything like that. But in terms of the number of repositories that we've provided, I think that list that I linked to earlier, which really was limited to just, NIH funded repositories is like over 100. So we have a really long history of supporting repositories, and that's only increased over time. But I'll see if my colleague Lisa wants to add anything about sort of, the NIH supported landscape of repositories.
Yeah, I think that list is a good place to start. It's not a completely comprehensive list. There are a number of other repositories that it's just a very big landscape. So that list does not have everything on it, but I think it is a really useful place to start, and agree with Taunton that there's quite a lot that NIH supports in terms of either repositories that we run here at NIH or repositories that we're funding people in the extramural community to do so.
Right, thank you. I think that's all we received during Taunton's talk. So we'll go to the next one. This was received during Cindy Danielson's talks. The first question, does this only apply to new studies? I think this, when you're talking about resubmission and renewal stuff. If not, what is the timeline expectation to have the plan in place for studies already funded and active?
So for grants, it does apply for competing applications only. So if you say just received a new competing award and you have a 5-year project, then it wouldn't affect you until 5 years, depending on where you are in your cycle. When you come back in for either competing renewal or a new application, that's when you would need to submit a data management sharing plan. If that, if you're conducting, if it is for research that's generating scientific data. So it will take a few years until all of the NIH funded and conducted research is subject to the policy. Because again, the goal is that you are proactively thinking about how to manage your data. It's not something you can do at the end. And we need to make sure that you have time to do that, to plan for that and to budget for it.
Thank you. Second one is, I've heard rumors that some competing NIH grants from the previous cycle are being requested to submit DMS plans during the process. Is this true? And if it's true, how are DMS budget costs being handled in these cases, since it wasn't applicable at time of application?
So I can't comment on any sort of specific application specific or announcement specific issues, but in general, NIH has updated all of its active funding opportunities to make sure that they do include, they do communicate the requirement for a data management and sharing plan in the application so that we can have this information. But if there are any sort of issues specific to your application, then do reach out to your program officer to, make sure that they'll have the right information at the right time.
Thank you. The third question was, this seems like it add 10 to 20% effort for every person on the project to be documenting and submitting every piece of data to a repository. Are all budgets increasing accordingly? It is a lot of work to document data well enough for it to be reused by someone unfamiliar with the project. By the way, I'm all for data sharing of useful data, including genomics, but a very high fraction of this data, hundreds of IF images we quantified to make one figure panel, will never be reused. So we are devoting a lot of resources to build a repository for not much benefit to society.
A lot of interesting questions here. So I'll start and I'll see if my colleagues have any more to add. But one, I think we don't know what are going to be useful data. They're kind of the current model of asking for, requesting data and maybe or maybe not gaining access to that data makes it a little difficult to determine what is actually useful data. Another point that this, we are stewards of taxpayer dollars, and we want to make sure that the money that's going to research can be used as much as possible. So that's just one thing to consider. Yes, this will be, this might be different depending on your area of research. This might be new to you, and it will be a learning period, and we do acknowledge that. We're looking forward to learning what it takes, how much it costs to manage and share data well in a way that can be reused, and also seeing the impact of this policy. And maybe Taunton has more to speak on that, but we're looking to see what this is doing in terms of increasing reuse of data.
So we do get this kind of question a lot. So what they're asking is often, what level of data do we need to share? So, I think it says scientific data of sufficient quality to validate and replicate findings. That's the definition. And let's say we generated one data figure to publish or share, and how much raw data do we need to curate and share in a repository?
So, let me say that the policy does not provide a specific sort of threshold for that. Rather, it's what meets the definition of scientific data, just like you were pointing out. And it's sort of the responsibility of the applicant to figure out in their particular context what that should be. I think something that's also important to keep in mind when answering that question is that, we provided a frequently asked question, about sort of this scenario specifically, and indicated that we are not expecting that all data generated during the course of an award be shared. It's really just those data that meet the definition of scientific data. And so, I want to be, really clear about that, because I have certainly been hearing a lot of people, suggesting that this means that all data need to be shared, but that's not, what we're asking for here.
Thank you. I think there's still a lot of questions around this topic. The next question. Would you please comment on how these plans will be included in the multi-component grant, such as the PO1? My understanding is that there will be one plan for the whole grant, not plans in each component.
That's correct. There will be one plan for one application, and if you do have a multi-component grant, take a look for any specific instructions there might be. But in general, we want to, you need to submit one plan, and that will cover anything that's relevant from the components. I think we have an FAQ on this, perhaps, but yes, one plan per application.
Thank you. I forgot to mention earlier, the NIH Extramural Nexus has been posting a lot of useful information lately. So if you haven't signed up for that, I highly encourage you to sign up because very specific DMS related news have been released that helps. Oops, sorry. The question 5, regarding the timing of data sharing, is it acceptable to delay sharing of data until after the end of the award to allow for a patent filing? Is this considered a justifiable reason to delay making the data available?
So Taunton, did you want to take this one, or do you want me to begin?
Yeah, I'm happy to do this. So, I mean, I think, the answer for right now is fairly simple. The policy does expect that data will, in general be shared, at the time of associated publication or by the end of the award, whichever comes sooner. But we may provide more guidance about this in the future.
Yeah, I think we also get this question a lot. So we're looking forward to having this answered in your FAQ page sometime. Thank you. The last question is, what if someone's effort is split? For example, 80% of research and 20% data sharing and management. Would you split out that one person's effort into different line items?
So for these types of specific budget questions, if you don't have an understanding of how to handle that based on your institutional officials, then I would say please do reach out to grants policy at nih.gov. That is our grants policy folks who can provide the best guidance on any questions you're running into about budget.
Thank you. So one particular question about that, is it okay to say, certain percent, or do we have to, specifically say dollar amount in the budget? Or should we ask the grant office about that?
Please do include that when you ask the grants policy mailbox. They'll be able to help with that.
All right, thank you. So we got a lot of new questions in live, but we also got a lot of pre-submitted questions. So we'll deal with the pre-submitted survey questions first, and then we'll go back to additional live questions that were submitted in the Q&A box. So a lot of them are addressed during talk, but these are the ones we're gonna answer live. So the first one, any of you can take this question. Under element 3, standards. Is it essential to list all the measurements that will be utilized in the study? If yes, does the name suffice, or should it be described more accurately? For example, SIS stroke impact scale, SIS stroke impact scale with the domains of physical strength, memory, mood, communication, activities of daily living, mobility, hand function, social participation, rated on Likert scale. So there's a lot of details.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So the DMS policy does not set specific expectations for the standards of like the description, and the sort of level of detail that should be provided for standards. But there is information, in sort of the sample data management and sharing plans that we've provided that might be sort of, helpful to sort of see, what, program officers who helped to draft these were thinking, for the standard section. I think really what matters is that the information that's, provided is sort of sufficient for NIH to be able, to assess whether data management and sharing has been, or will be maximized.
All right, thank you. The second question is there a specific type of license that should be listed on OSF for data from NIH funded projects?
I can take this one. So OSF, for those that aren't aware, is the Open Science Framework. It is one of those generalist repositories that I mentioned. So with regard to licenses, there's not a specific type of license that the policy recommends or requires. Some repositories will have, sort of a blanket license for everything. So this may not even be something that you would have to choose. But there are other repositories that do make the option available for the submitter to choose which type of license they would want. And usually the differences in these licenses have to do with what people can do with the content that you're sharing and how they have to attribute credit to you for creating the data or the content. So for example, you might select a license where you say that somebody can reuse the data, but they can't modify it and then go on to share it in a modified form. Or you might say that you can reuse the data, but you have to cite me and give me credit in this way. So the question of which license you should select will really depend on your choices with regard to those two questions. And for specific questions, this is the kind of thing that libraries would often be able to help with.
Right. Thank you, Lisa. I think we often suggest Creative Commons. I think there are various types of Creative Commons. CC BY is the most common one. And then, like I said, share alike, SA, or for non-commercial, NC. So most repositories really have a choice to select. So I think we can go by that one. So thank you. The last question has 3 separate questions inside. So first one, for R01 submissions, I would like some clarification on what information is now included in the resource sharing plan given the new data management sharing plan. I think this one was the answer during the talk, or would you like to re-clarify?
Yeah, so I did address that during the talk, but just to reiterate, the resource sharing plan, that section moving forward is used for other sharing policies that might be triggered, namely the model organisms and research tools. And there also might be funding opportunity announcement specific requirements. And so, they'll ask for that within your funding opportunity announcement, but it's not going to be that you'll have to submit a resource sharing plan with every application. It's really only when there's a policy that's triggering that's not the data management and sharing policy, or if the institute, the center or office funding the announcement has indicated a requirement.
Okay, thank you. Second one was, if our research included qualitative data, such as interviews with the focus group, what is the extent of the data that should be shared? I think Taunton can answer this question.
Sure, yeah, so we've indicated, I think, pretty clearly that, qualitative data can be considered scientific data if it meets the definition. There are, certain repositories out there that, can accept, types of qualitative data. Obviously, if there are sort of concerns about privacy for sharing those data, we've provided, a number of different resources to help sort of walk through different considerations. And obviously, ultimately the policy does say that, it is potentially justifiable in some cases to limit sharing if there are, privacy, issues that, can't be addressed.
Thank you. The last question is, what is the level of oversight this should be expected?
So I think this is sort of referring again to that last element in the data or the recommended elements of a data management and sharing plan about sort of oversight of the plan. I think we've clarified that element is really referring to oversight by the funded institution rather than by NIH, but we're not, I think sort of specifically indicating kind of what level of oversight is necessary, and and the policy isn't creating sort of any expectations about who specifically at an institution is sort of responsible for oversight of the plan. So that's something that I think institutions have a fair amount of flexibility to sort of implement in the way that works best for them. And as I mentioned, I think it's important for applicants to sort of talk within their institution to figure out what the best practice is for listing there.
Thank you. I think this question is addressed because a lot of sample plans, NIH sample plans, have their specific language. So we actually had a disclaimer on our website. Once you OSRS does not have the oversight compliance plan at the moment, at least. So please do not put that language in your DMS plan, and check with them if you have any questions. So I just wanted to put that out there. So I think that's all. We have to check. We have 4 minutes left, so we'll see if there's anything we can answer in the live Q&A section. Okay, going forward, how will NIH measure outcomes of the new data policy with regard to reproducibility and public trust, which are among the main reasons for these new policies?
So we're still sort of working on the actual evaluation effort that we'll be undertaking for this policy. I think we are going to look at both of those issues, but there's also sort of a lot of nearer term issues as well, both looking at issues of cost and burden and sort of clarity for people as well. So we'll be looking at a range of different issues, including those.
Thank you. So we'll take one more question here. So regarding immediate release of all award data at the end of an award, my take on the DNP policy of releasing all data at the end of the award is that some types of investigators, for example, protein structure investigators, microbiome, genomics investigators, should never collect data in the last 2 years of an NIH award to avoid having to release that data before that investigator can analyze and publish it. Otherwise, that investigator and all associated trainees or collaborators risk being scooped and suffering irreparable career damage. Feel free to comment. Would you like to take this question?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll just say I think that sharing by the end of the period of performance is something that we've indicated fairly early before anybody even applies for an award. So you have a good opportunity to sort of plan for what you're going to be doing over the course of the application. So none of these timelines should be sort of surprising anybody.
Thank you. I think we are on time, so we'll wrap this up here. Again, we'd like to thank you all for coming, and particularly our presenters for the amazing talk and for answering all these questions. This session has been recorded and will be shared along with the slides on the Love Data Week webpage, and we'll also email to all registrants and also announced through our DMS newsletter. And this last slide shows the contact information for Becker Data Management Sharing Services. If you click on names, it'll go to our profile page with our contact info and blog post. And feel free to contact us with any DMS related questions or request consultations. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful week, and check out the rest of the Love Data Week session. Thank you.